CEO, Alivan Business Advisory, to talk to us about how he's seeing everything that's playing out in global geopolitics. Great having you here, Alistair. Give us a sense, first off. Do you believe that this could be a conflict which could last more than a few weeks or maybe even a few months? Or is this something that will get unwound as quickly as it's begun?
I would actually be bluffing completely if I were to say to you that I have any idea at all about how and when this conflict is actually going to end.
Sure.
And I would say the same with all due respect to anybody else who were to come up with a firm opinion about that. However, the signs are that it is going to drag on for some time yet, but there are two major limiting factors at play here, which we need to consider and about which we have no degree of certainty, but we can take some reasonable assumptions. First of all, the Iranians do appear to be trying to drag it out as long as they can on the grounds that they can outlast Donald Trump. Now, all that being said, their supply of drones and missiles is ultimately limited, and the Israelis and the Americans are doing their best to destroy them on the ground, not least to destroy missile launchers. So sooner or later, Iran is going to run out of the capability to strike back. Secondly, one thing which I think is underappreciated is, notwithstanding Donald Trump's claim a couple of days ago that the Americans could fight this war for as long as it takes, the reality is that it is extraordinarily expensive in both operational terms and indeed wear and tear on military equipment to keep those American warships in the Gulf region for a protracted period of time. Exactly how long they can stay there is not clear, but I've heard experts talking about maybe a month, 5 weeks maximum. Now, of course, in market terms, 5 weeks is an eternity, but I do think there is a limit for how long conflict at this level of intensity can continue. And I do think we need to be realistic and to say, nevertheless, that the end is not in sight yet. So I don't know. If I were to say a month, it would be a guess, but it's not inconsistent with what some experts are thinking at the present time.
Great. You've set the context really well, but you spoke about a couple of pieces, and let me unpack that, Alistair. The first piece you spoke about is the fact that you've got Iranian launchers as well as drones on ground, which America as well as Israel plus allies are kind of neutralizing, if I can call it that. And that could accelerate the end of the war, right? By a substantial bit, because that will basically clip any wings that Iran actually has to counter. How quickly do you expect that to possibly happen? Is there a timeline in your opinion as to when that could be so, or when could we expect that to be so?
Again, that's a really difficult question to answer.
Right.
And I think that we need to bring another factor into play here, which is particularly important from the perspective of financial markets. Yesterday, Donald Trump mulled out loud about two possibilities, which are extraordinarily relevant. The first is having the US Navy convoy tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, which has been done in the past. If we think back long enough to the Iran-Iraq conflict, an international navy ultimately was convoying tankers through the Gulf through the Straits during that conflict. That does need to happen again, in my view, if we're going to see some relief in oil markets. And we did see the price of Brent crude drop off by a couple of bucks yesterday at the mere mention. The second was Donald Trump's mulling over the possibility of having the Development Finance Corporation in the US underwrite insurance rates for tankers looking to navigate the strait. Now, I said on ET Now on Sunday that I thought insurance was a critical factor here. I still think that is the case, as indeed is the hiring cost for major tankers. So if we see some follow through to what Mr. Trump said yesterday, the first thing it's going to mean is there will be a concerted effort by US and presumably Israeli forces to focus on Iran's ability to hit tankers with drone strikes and missile strikes. And that would be a significant game changer because at the moment, the spread of targets in Iran, which Israel and the US are striking, is very wide. If they were to concentrate more on debilitating Iran's strike back capability, I think we would see some easing in oil prices fairly quickly.
Right. I'm not sure, Alistair, if you have a view with regard to this. In terms of stockpiles, Iran has a large stockpile of ballistic missiles, right? So this could well escalate as well. We're trying to downplay any escalation at this point, but it could escalate. Also, in terms of the THAAD interceptor, the US there are reports which suggest that US has used around 25% of those interceptors already. And there could be a shortage of that if this situation could prolong, or if the war could prolong. Is it therefore in US's best interest to quickly nip this in the bud? And will they resort to a more extreme means of warfare to try and accelerate that, in your opinion?
I'm not sure what you mean by more extreme. So I'm not going to ask you to define that either, because you might get in trouble with your producers. But I don't see yet any likelihood of the US putting boots on the ground, if that's what you have in mind. We might see special forces operations, either by the Israelis or the US, to help to reduce Iran's missile and perhaps more especially drone capability quickly. Drones are remarkably difficult to take out while they are in the air, particularly compared to missiles. But your basic point is absolutely right. This is a sort of reverse arms race between whether Iran will run out of missiles before America and its allies in the Gulf run out of anti-missile technology. And we don't know as yet where that is going to end. What we do know is that there is a lot of concern on the Arab side of the Gulf, and that there is a lot of now liaison among GCC members to try to come up with some sort of concerted response, which is quite remarkable when you consider how bad relations have been between Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular of late. This has brought them together. There was an emergency GCC meeting on Sunday. I would imagine that we are going to see some shift among the GCC countries if Iran continues to launch strikes against them. So far, we've not seen the GCC countries get involved militarily at all. Possible first step would be for them to allow the US to use its bases in the GCC countries for military strikes against Iran. And I do think that's something we may see even before the end of this week on the current trajectory.
Right. Alistair, say the war closes and say we have a resolution. How likely is it, and how quickly will it restore stability to the Middle East, in your opinion? Because the regime still remains the same. This resolution will likely mean a regime change in Iran. How easy, difficult is that going to be? Because that is the ultimate goal, right? And that should also give us a perspective as to how quickly this can end.
I think you're talking about two separate things here, with all due respect. The end of military action and a resolution. They are not one and the same. The end of military action would certainly lead to an easing and pressure on energy markets, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to see anything remotely resembling a regime change in Iran. Now, we also have to be quite careful what we mean by regime change. We may see something which sort of looks like a bit of a regime change, but maybe with the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, taking a firmer grip on power than it enjoys already at the expense of the theocracy. We're not, as far as I can see at this stage, going to see anything along the lines of what we saw in Venezuela, where you have an acting president who is basically on pretty good terms with the US, and where the US has effectively taken control of Venezuelan oil supplies. I think we're not talking about that sort of scenario at all. I think dislodging the regime totally in Iran would be very difficult indeed. And if it were to be dislodged, there's no guarantee that it would be taken over, that the country would be taken over by a regime which would be anything remotely different to what we have at the moment in terms of its hostility towards the West. We could even see the country descending into chaos. The big problem we have at the end of the day is we actually have no clear idea of what Donald Trump's war aims are, even if he does. I think we know what Benjamin Netanyahu's are, which is regime change. I think that's very clear indeed. But what exactly he expects to take over is not clear. And maybe he just sees regime change as being a weakening of Israel's arch enemy in the region to the point where it no longer poses a threat, whatever sort of chaos results in Iran internally.
Alistair, this has been engaging, and it's been great in terms of a perspective. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Okay.